It was a quiet Wednesday morning, the kind where the world seems to hold its breath before the noise of the day begins. My sister, Lena, had just rolled herself to the front door in her wheelchair. A daily ritual. She loved watching the sunrise peek through the maple trees lining her modest suburban street. To her, those quiet few minutes were sacred time to sip tea, reflect, and breathe in the peace she fought so hard to reclaim after the accident. But that morning, peace was a luxury she wouldn't get to keep. Out of nowhere, the thunderous growl of heavy machinery shattered the calm. Lena froze. She could hear the distinct rumble of a diesel engine, a sound far too aggressive for her sleepy neighborhood. From her spot at the window, she spotted the culprit. A massive bright orange city demolition truck crawling toward her driveway, like a mechanical beast on a mission. It wasn't alone. A team of 3 men followed, their hard hats glinting under the morning sun, clipboards in hand, neon safety vests swinging casually as they moved with practiced ease. They looked like they had done this 100 times before. Just another demolition job. Just another non-compliant structure to remove. They didn't knock. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't even glance toward the front door. Heart pounded in her chest. She tried to get to the door, tried to roll faster, but she was still halfway across the room when she heard the first shriek of a saw blade slicing through wood. By the time she swung the door open, her voice drowned out by machinery. They were already halfway through dismantling the ramp that had been her lifeline for 5 years. This wasn't just a ramp. It wasn't a cosmetic addition or some do-it-weekend project. It was her bridge to the world. After the accident that severed her spinal cord and changed her life forever, that ramp was the very first structure she had rebuilt. Not just for mobility, but for independence. She had fought with the insurance company to help fund it. She'd worked with an accessibility contractor to ensure it was up to every ADA standard. It had been a symbol of hope, crafted from pain and persistence. And now it was splinters, falling to the ground. When she called me, I knew something was wrong before she even spoke. Her voice, usually so steady, was trembling. Fragile. They're tearing it down, she whispered, her voice cracking. Who is the city? They're here, right now. They said it's not up to code. I was already out the door before she finished. I didn't even hang up the phone. I just drove, one hand gripping the steering wheel, the other tightening with fury around the phone. No notice, no call. Number, citation, no chance to fix anything. What kind of city bulldozes a wheelchair ramp without even a warning? By the time I pulled up to her house, the ramp was already gone. All that remained was a jagged slope of dirt, chunks of broken wood, and a pile of screws that glinted like scars in the morning sun. Lena was in the grass. Not the porch, because without the ramp, she couldn't reach it. She looked small, overwhelmed, devastated. Not just physically stranded, but emotionally gutted. It felt like watching someone tear down a part of her soul. And here's the twist they never saw coming. Lena is the sitting governor of our state. You wouldn't know it to look at her. She's humble, no suits, no entourage, just jeans, cardigans, and a warm smile. She doesn't live in a mansion or have bodyguards. She chose to stay in her old neighborhood because she believes public servants should stay connected to the people they serve. Grocery store trips, library readings, community barbecues. She does it all without fanfare. And that ramp, she paid for it herself. That's so when that demolition crew made their call, when they saw a ramp and thought liability or noncompliance, they had no idea who they were dealing with. They didn't see a governor. They saw a disabled woman with no voice, no power, and no right to fight back. That was their mistake. But Lena didn't lash out. She didn't summon the press or take to social media. She didn't call for heads to roll. Instead, she called for a meeting. In a small, unassuming room inside City Hall. Lena sat across from the officials responsible for what had happened. She didn't start with accusations. She started with a story. She spoke slowly, deliberately, telling them what it was like to wake up in a hospital after the crash, unable to move. What it meant to lie there day after day, looking at ceiling tiles, wondering if she'd ever walk again or even roll herself to a window to see the sunrise. She told them about the loneliness, the quiet despair that creeps in when the world becomes inaccessible. She talked about the day her ramp was built, how she cried the first time she rolled down it without help, how it made her feel human again. The room was silent. And then she said something that stopped them cold. I'm the one who approved your infrastructure funding last year. I signed off on your grants, I reviewed your ADA compliance reports, and I trusted your departments to serve the people of this state with integrity. The director of public works looked like he had been slapped, his face drained of color. His voice faltered as he apologized. Over and over, he offered to rebuild the ramp, better and safer, at city expense. Lena declined. She said she didn't want a new ramp for herself. She wanted change for everyone. She proposed a sweeping audit of how accessibility complaints were handled across the state. She offered funding for accessibility training, public service reforms, and educational outreach. She made it clear, this wasn't about punishment. It was about progress. And then something remarkable happened. City officials started calling her office mayors, council members, engineers. They weren't defensive, they were inspired. Lena's calm dignity and quiet strength had changed their perspective, but not everyone was happy. Behind the scenes, powerful interests began to push back. Developers, insurers, and construction lobbies didn't want new oversight. They saw Lena's ideas as expensive, disruptive. They whispered in hallways, warned of budget cuts, stirred opposition, and just like that, Lena's quiet act of leadership ignited a firestorm. After the quiet but powerful meeting Lena held with the city officials, word began to spread beyond our small community. Reporters caught wind of the story, not because Lena sought attention, but because one of the aides in the room posted a thoughtful thread on social media. It wasn't scandalous or sensational, it was honest. It told the story of a governor who had her accessibility stripped away and responded with reform, not revenge. The post went viral. Within days, major news outlets began requesting interviews. Lena declined most of them. She agreed to one hour-long sit-down with a local public radio host. It wasn't glamorous, but it was authentic. During the interview, she walked the audience through everything: her injury, her fight to regain independence, and the moment she watched strangers tear away her dignity in the form of splintered wood. She explained why she didn't lash out, why she chose reform over retribution, and she talked about the bigger problem: how many disabled residents live in fear of code violations, unable to afford legal battles or draw media attention. She emphasized how the system, even unintentionally, punishes the most vulnerable. That interview struck a nerve. It wasn't just shared, it was studied. Community colleges used it in ethics classes. Advocacy groups clipped quotes for training seminars. It was clear Lena had tapped into something deeper than policy. She had exposed a blind spot in how local governments treat accessibility not as a necessity, but as an afterthought. Meanwhile, the resistance we feared began to grow louder. A coalition of developers and real estate lobbyists released a statement criticizing Lena's proposed accessibility reforms. They claimed the regulations would drive up costs, delay projects, and open the door to frivolous lawsuits. They painted her initiative as overreach in an attempt to score political points. Behind the scenes, they began funding campaigns to pressure local officials. They spread misinformation online, warning property owners that Lena's audit would result in mass fines. They used scare tactics, claiming small businesses would go bankrupt trying to keep up with compliance. But Lena didn't flinch. She doubled down. She assembled a task force of urban planners, architects, disability advocates, and even former code enforcers. Their mission: to design an accessibility framework that was both enforceable and empathetic. Lena knew that effective policy couldn't come from one perspective. It needed balance. The task force held town halls across the state. They listened to stories, some heartbreaking, some infuriating: seniors trapped in apartments because elevators kept failing, parents of disabled children being fined for building custom ramps without permits, veterans forced to crawl up steps when their wheelchairs couldn't make it inside local businesses. Each story added weight to the cause. Each testimony became a brick in the foundation of a new vision. At the same time, unexpected allies began to step forward. A group of veterans publicly endorsed Lena's proposal. So did the state's teachers union, whose members saw the impact of accessibility daily in schools. Even a few building contractors broke ranks with their lobby groups and offered to help revise construction standards. But Lena's most surprising supporter came from inside the opposition: a former lobbyist named Ray Thomason. Ray had spent decades fighting against accessibility mandates. He had always seen them as profit killers. But after hearing Lena's interview, something shifted. He requested a private meeting. Ray walked into Lena's office with humility, admitted he had never truly considered the human cost of the policies he fought against. He said his wife had recently suffered a stroke and now used a walker. He had seen, firsthand, how inaccessible the world could be. Lena didn't judge him. She welcomed him onto the task force. Ray's insider knowledge proved invaluable. He helped dismantle false arguments used by lobbyists and showed how accessibility improvements could actually reduce liability for businesses long-term. He helped reframe the conversation from regulation to investment. The draft of the Access Initiative, short for Accessible Communities Through Compassionate Enforcement and Sensible Standards, was finalized 3 months after Lena's ramp was torn down. It was comprehensive but clear. It included grants for small businesses, training for local officials, and a new hotline for residents facing accessibility issues. The proposal was submitted to the legislature with bipartisan support. Lena didn't parade it through the media. She let the policy speak for itself. But just as things began to look hopeful, the backlash intensified. A shadowy political action committee started running attack ads. They painted Lena as an out-of-touch elitist, claiming she was punishing working-class builders to promote a personal agenda. They used footage of the ramp demolition out of context. They edited her interview to make it seem like she didn't care about small businesses. It was smear politics at its worst. Still, Lena refused to go negative. She stayed the course. She met with more communities. She walked or rolled into council chambers unannounced to answer questions directly. She brought data, she brought compassion, and most importantly, she brought stories. Because at the heart of it all, Lena believed in something radical, that leadership meant service, not dominance. As the vote on the Access Initiative approached, the pressure reached a boiling point. Protesters gathered outside the Capitol, some for, some against. Editorials filled newspapers. The governor's mansion received both flowers and hate mail, but Lena stayed focused. The night before the vote, she visited the remains of her old ramp. The wood had been cleared away, but the scar on the sidewalk remained. She sat in silence, remembering what it had felt like to lose something so essential. Then she whispered to herself, "Never again. Not for me, not for anyone." The morning of the vote arrived like a storm on the horizon, tense, electric, and uncertain. The Access Initiative was scheduled for debate on the House floor by 10 a.m. outside the Capitol. Dozens of citizens in wheelchairs lined the marble steps. Others held signs with messages like "Dignity is a right," "We deserve access," and "Lena's law equals justice." Inside, the mood was different. Stiff collars, rustling papers, and whispers filled the chamber. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle had been lobbied relentlessly over the last several weeks. The pressure was mounting. Developers had poured thousands into last-minute campaigns to block the initiative, but so had supporters, advocates, unions, medical professionals, even teachers. The vote was expected to be close. Lena had spent the night before calling legislators personally, not as governor, but as someone asking them to see beyond the numbers. She didn't beg, she didn't threaten, she shared stories, real ones. One of those stories had stuck with Senator Curtis Dalton, a Republican from a rural district who had previously voted against similar measures. He was known for being firm, practical, and difficult to sway. But he had a grandson with muscular dystrophy. The night before the vote, he watched Lena's public radio interview with his daughter. When it ended, Eli turned to his grandfather and simply asked, "Would this law help kids like me?" That question rewrote Dalton's priorities. At 10:03 a.m., he stood to speak. His speech wasn't fiery. It was steady, vulnerable, and deeply personal. He shared Eli's story, his family's struggles with getting proper ramps installed in schools and clinics, and the emotional toll of being turned away by a system that didn't understand. Dalton concluded, "This isn't about red tape. It's about red lines we've drawn between who gets to live freely and who has to fight for every step. I won't let my vote be another barrier." Gasps filled the room. Everyone had expected him to vote no. The tide began to shift. Other lawmakers stood to offer similar testimonies. Some were quiet allies who now felt empowered to speak. Others were previously undecided but had been moved by Lena's campaign, not just in politics, but in humanity. When the final vote was called, silence overtook the chamber. The Access Initiative passed by a margin of 3 votes. There were tears, applause, even some stunned silence from those who had underestimated how far this moment would reach. Outside, the crowd of advocates erupted in cheers. For many, it was the first time they felt seen, not as problems to be managed, but as people whose voices had power. Lena didn't give a victory speech. She walked, or rather, rolled out the side door of the Capitol and returned to her office, quietly signing the bill into law before sunset. She didn't need a stage. Her triumph was in the law, in the lives it would touch. But victory came at a cost. The backlash didn't disappear, simply adapted. Lawsuits were filed. Construction firms tried to delay implementation. Some lawmakers who voted yes were hit with negative campaign ads. Lena herself was painted in a national tabloid as the governor with a rampage, accusing her of weaponizing her disability. She didn't flinch. Instead, she set up a pilot program to test the access reforms in 3 counties. She hired 8 specialists, provided training to inspectors, and created an online portal for citizens to report access issues. In the first month, the portal received 7,000 submissions, everything from broken elevators in apartment buildings to clinics with no ramps. Lena personally reviewed the first 500 complaints. She made phone calls to landlords. She sent handwritten letters to families. She showed up, unannounced, to businesses, accused of violations, not to shame them, but to learn. Most were shocked. A few were hostile, but many listened. And then came the first big test. A large shopping center in the state's capital, owned by a powerful real estate group, was found to have multiple accessibility violations. Narrow doorways, broken sidewalks, bathrooms that couldn't accommodate wheelchairs. They refused to comply with the new standards. The company's CEO tried to make it political. He called a press conference and accused Lena of targeting his business. He called her reforms anti-growth and claimed they would destroy the state's economy. Lena didn't respond with outrage. She responded with data. She held a town hall, inviting the public and the press. She presented statistics, how accessible businesses were seeing higher foot traffic, fewer liability claims, and increased customer satisfaction. She brought in business owners who had complied with access and seen improved profits. Then she gave the floor to a teenager named Camila, high schooler with cerebral palsy who couldn't use the shopping center's restrooms. Camila didn't yell, she just said, "It's not fair that my friends can shop and I can't." That single sentence, broadcast across every major news network in the state, broke the CEO's narrative. The shopping center caved within days. They agreed to a full renovation. That moment proved something. Accessibility wasn't a burden, it was a benefit. And Lena's vision wasn't just morally right, it made economic sense. Lena's access reforms didn't just change lives, they changed the conversation. What began as a quiet act of leadership rippled across the nation. Other governors took notice. State houses began requesting copies of the legislation. City councils started inviting Lena to speak. Advocacy groups that once struggled to be heard were now receiving calls from lawmakers asking for their input. The change was undeniable and Lena was at the heart of it. Media outlets finally caught on, not to a scandal, but to a revolution. They covered stories of local transformations, restaurants adding ramps and braille menus, schools building accessible restrooms and playgrounds, bus systems updating for wheelchair lifts, and clearer announcements. Lena had ignited a movement that went far beyond infrastructure. It wasn't just about compliance. It was about dignity, about being seen, and about never having to apologize for needing access. As the movement grew, Lena's calendar filled. Beyond capacity, she was in constant motion, keynoting conferences, meeting with mayors, responding to letters from parents, veterans, and students. She fielded calls from educators seeking resources, hospital administrators asking for design recommendations, and even small-town pastors trying to retrofit old churches. She always made time, but change rarely comes without a price. Lena's health began to suffer. Between travel, public appearances, legislative updates, and non-stop advocacy, her body felt the strain. Quietly, she began using a cane. In addition to her wheelchair, the nights got longer. Some days, she operated on caffeine and determination alone. Her staff noticed the dark circles, the slight tremors, the occasional distant look in her eyes. She kept going anyway. Then, one night after hosting a town hall in a rural county, one of the very areas that had once resisted her reforms, Lena collapsed. She had just stepped off stage, smiling and waving, when her legs gave way and her body sank into the arms of a security guard. Paramedics were called. Cameras caught none of it. Her team acted quickly and respectfully at the hospital. Doctors diagnosed her with severe exhaustion, compounded by chronic stress and dehydration. They were firm. If she didn't truly rest, she risked more than burnout. She risked permanent damage. Lena hated the idea of slowing down, but she was a realist, and she knew that leadership sometimes meant letting go. So for the first time in years, she paused. She delegated responsibilities to her trusted advisors. She canceled a month of travel. She turned off her phone. And she began to heal, even from her recovery bed. She kept working. She reviewed documents. She zoomed into task force meetings when she felt strong enough. She wrote letters, long, thoughtful, ones to city officials, newly elected legislators, and even a group of high schoolers who had started an Access for All club after watching one of her speeches. Her message never wavered. What she had built wasn't just policy, it was momentum, and it didn't depend on her alone. Lena had inspired others to carry the flame, and they did. During her recovery, her staff expanded training programs, launched a podcast to educate small businesses, and introduced a grant initiative to retrofit historical buildings with accessibility upgrades. Lena's brief absence from the spotlight didn't slow the movement, it gave others room to grow into their roles. And as she sat on her back porch, wrapped in a blanket, sipping herbal tea, watching the sunrise, she smiled. She knew the best was yet to come. Lena's return to public life wasn't marked by fanfare, but by purpose. Months after her collapse, she emerged more focused, more resolute, and more determined to ensure the momentum she had ignited would never slow again. She no longer tried to be everywhere at once. Instead, she empowered local leaders, amplified new voices, and built systems that could operate without her constant supervision. One of her most ambitious undertakings, post-recovery, was the creation of the statewide Access Commission on Independent Oversight, body made up of advocates, engineers, architects, and citizens with disabilities. This commission had full authority to inspect, report, and enforce the ACCESS standards Lena had fought so hard to implement. It wasn't just about enforcing compliance, it was about creating a permanent structure of accountability that would long outlast any election cycle. The commission's first report revealed sweeping improvements. Across the state, public schools with inclusive playgrounds, hospitals now equipped with visual and auditory alerts, museums restructured to allow wheelchair access on all floors. And still, there was more to be done. Lena knew it, and she never stopped reminding the public that accessibility wasn't a checklist, it was a mindset. She launched a statewide campaign called Access is Freedom, aimed at educating communities through TV spots, local workshops, and partnerships with small businesses. The campaign's signature video featured ordinary citizens using accessibility features in extraordinary ways: a grandfather navigating a ramp to attend his granddaughter's recital, a delivery worker using a lift to drop off supplies to a mountain library, a young woman using voice access technology to run her own graphic design business from home. The message resonated. Soon, other states adopted the same slogan. Governors reached out to Lena for guidance. A few even asked her to consider federal office. She declined. Lena wasn't interested in Washington. Her work, she believed, was best done close to the ground, rooted in community. Instead, she turned her attention to education. With support from the legislature, she helped establish a statewide curriculum on civic responsibility and inclusive design. For the first time, students were learning not only the history of the ADA, but the philosophy behind it: equal access as a human right. Meanwhile, Lena's sister, Marla, woman whose ramp had been bulldozed, whose pain had sparked a fire main, at her side. The two often attended town halls together. Marla spoke of the personal toll, the early days of heartbreak and helplessness. Lena followed with a broader view: the policy, the movement, the legacy. One evening, during a Q&A at a university, a student asked, "Governor, what would you have done if that ramp hadn't been destroyed?" Lena paused, then smiled. "Probably the same thing," she said, "but maybe slower, maybe with less fire." Sometimes injustice kicks open the door that courage has been knocking on. That quote made headlines, not because it was provocative, but because it was true. Years passed, but Lena's story remained part of the state's DNA. She retired from politics to teach at a state university, where she developed a popular course called Policy for People. The class filled within minutes each semester. She mentored young leaders, some with disabilities, some without, all united by a belief that systems must serve everyone. The shopping center that had once refused to comply with accessibility reforms, it now bore a bronze plaque near the entrance. This facility was transformed through the Access Initiative, championed by Governor Lena Moore. Access is freedom. And what of the original HOA, the one that had started it all by bulldozing Marla's ramp? Ironically, they became one of the first neighborhood associations to win a statewide award for inclusive design. After public scrutiny and legal challenges, they rebuilt not just the ramp, but their entire approach. They added handrails, widened sidewalks, even changed their bylaws to include representation from residents with disabilities. Lena never stepped foot in one of their meetings again, but her influence was there, carved into every new ramp they installed. In her final public address, delivered in front of the state capitol on the 10-year anniversary of the ACCSS law's passage, Lena stood at the same podium where she had once been ignored. This time, the crowd was massive. She spoke not about policy, but about people, about how every step forward was paved by voices that had once been silenced, about how justice wasn't loud, it was persistent, about how sometimes the greatest revolutions begin with something as simple as a ramp. And then, she told a story. She spoke of a young girl in a small town who had written her a letter. The girl had a rare bone disorder and used a motorized chair. Her family had struggled to get her enrolled in a local dance class because the studio had stairs and no accessible bathroom. But after the access laws were enforced, the studio received a grant, remodeled, and the girl was able to join. The girl ended her letter with this: "Thank you for fighting for my dance." Lena choked up as she read it, because at its core, that's what all of it had been about. Not just laws or politics, but the ability to live fully, to dance, to show up, to be counted. Her voice steadied as she closed. We are not defined by what we build for ourselves, but by what we build for others. If a child can dance, if a grandmother can vote, if a worker can reach the second floor, then we are doing our job. The crowd erupted, cameras flashed, flags waved. Somewhere in the front row, Marla wiped a tear. Lena stepped back from the podium, not as a governor, not as a politician, but as a sister, a citizen, and a builder of bridges where walls had once stood. And so the story ended, not with vengeance, or bitterness, or even triumph. It ended with a ramp, and all the lives that could now cross it.